Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Don't Risk It podcast presented by VFIS Client Risk Solutions. This program focuses on the exposures our clients frequently encounter and discusses some potential solutions to help reduce these exposures. I'm your host, Chris Rogers with VFIS Client Risk Solutions, and today we're attempting to clear up some of the confusion as it relates to requirements versus recommendations in emergency services. I want to welcome Justin Eberly to the program. Justin is an education specialist with VFIS in the Education, Training, and Consulting Division. Justin is joining us today to offer some guidance on what is an operational requirement for emergency services versus recommended best practices. Justin, it's good to see you, and I want to thank you for joining the program.
Thanks for having me, Chris.
Absolutely. So I'll start with a simple question that is short and sweet. What exactly is compliance?
Well, see, anytime I look for a definition, I look for the definition from the dictionary. Webster defines compliance as conformity in fulfilling official requirements. The vast majority of emergency responders really set out to do the right thing. Turn on the TV, scroll through social media, and even listen to the podcasts, and you'll find examples of when something goes terribly, terribly wrong. Typically, that's when VFIS engages whenever there is some type of an insurance claim, and it's something that we need to look at and understand where those risks are. Whether it's intentional or unintentional, the wrongdoing or a mistake made within an emergency services organization makes for a bold headline. We hear about it every day. When something goes wrong, what more should have been done? Could something have been done differently in the future? And what ultimately went wrong?
So what are the official requirements an emergency service organization must comply with?
There's a lot of reasons why emergency services organizations have a long list of requirements that they must fulfill, and it's grown over time. Of course, the specific requirements may differ based upon the type of organization, the type of operations that organization carries out on an everyday basis, or even the jurisdiction that they operate within. Ultimately, I don't want to get into a high school civics lesson here, but there's multiple levels of government. From federal, state, county, and other local governments, they all have the authority to enact laws. A regulation can be adopted by a government agency with the specific statutory authority to do so under the law. Regulations detail how that law will be enforced by a government agency. It's important to remember that all personnel must comply with all laws and applicable regulations unless a specific exemption exists. This is the box that we have to operate within, and with that, you're either in compliance or you're out of compliance. There will almost certainly be criminal or civil consequences for being non-compliant with laws. Failure to comply with regulations may result in other disciplinary actions such as suspension of a professional license or a certification.
So to kind of follow up on that disciplinary action that you spoke of, can an emergency service organization be subject to regulatory regulations from more than one government agency?
Absolutely. Fire department could be subject to regulations adopted by an office of the state fire marshal for something like hazardous materials operations. A fire department may be subject to Department of Environmental Protection or Department of Transportation. Other agencies, both at the federal and state level. If an ambulance service is a covered entity under HIPAA, this law and related rules issued by the United States Department of Health and Human Services would apply. An ambulance service may or may not be subject to additional requirements outlined by State Office of EMS rules and regulations. It's the multiple levels of bureaucracy that can really present a challenge when seeking clarification or even looking for an official interpretation of these laws and regulations. Again, while fire and EMS organizations ultimately try to operate in some unique ways, it's important to remember that every law and regulation applies unless there's a specific exemption that exists.
What about a non-governmental organization like NFPA or CAS?
Many believe that these standard development organizations like the National Fire Protection Association, NFPA, or Commission on Accreditation for Ambulance Services, CAS, or other organizations like that, may have the force of law within an emergency services organization. It's important to recognize how a standard is developed, by whom it's developed by, and what impact it may have on the emergency services organization. By no means is an industry standard going to address every variable, every circumstance, and every unique challenge that's faced by any organization in any given jurisdiction. It obviously isn't the law unless a government agency has gone and enacted a law that makes those industry standards identical to the rule of law. An industry standard does not possess that same rule of law. However, that government agency may adopt an industry standard as a regulation. In this case, it is the government agency, not the standard development organization, who makes the decision and has that enforcement authority. Chris, I have a question for you now. What about the Manage Your Risk bulletins that are published by VFIS? Would that be enforceable by any type of law?
Well, these are typically recommendations based upon risk management principles. While they're not necessarily requirements to be insured, following these recommendations will help to reduce the claims and potentially avoid substantial increases to the insurance premium. An insurance policy is bound with specific coverages and exclusions, so you should consult with your local insurance agent to understand what is and what isn't covered by your insurance. And if there are any requirements, they should be clearly stated in the insurance policy. So what about organizational policies, procedures, and guidelines?
Well, similarly, an emergency services organization must be developing policies, procedures, and guidelines to comply with laws and regulations. While an emergency services organization can be more stringent than what the law or regulation may say, you should consult with legal counsel before doing so. You could be inadvertently going and causing impinged defense in a legal case. So it's very important that you consult with an attorney.
That's something that we definitely suggest whenever we give those manager risk documents out is, these are a baseline, a guideline to kind of get you started. But we always suggest that every state or every area might have a little different nuance to how they do things. So using local legal counsel is very beneficial. I agree.
Absolutely. And going and connecting a few dots here, we have the industry standards and best practices. They should be considered as an organization goes and develops their policies, procedures, and guidelines. While it's within the discretion of your organization to develop and implement these policies, procedures, and guidelines, be able to justify what you do and how you do it.
So how can an emergency service organization navigate all of this complexity in the world today?
Well, first and foremost, an emergency services organization should consult legal counsel. Then seek out information from a reputable source. If you're told something, trust, but also verify. Look it up yourself. Know where it comes from. To clear things up, I would offer this. Cite the primary source. Is it a reliable source? Where's the information coming from? Evaluate the applicability to your organization or its personnel. Does an exemption exist for your emergency services organization for your operation? And then determine the level of authority that may have or may not have over your organization or your personnel. What are the consequences of non-compliance? Finally, decide what you should do. Should clarification be provided in the form of operational policies, procedures, or guidelines? And then finally, define expectations for your personnel. Summarize and share the source in the form of training.
Well, Justin, I really appreciate you hopping on today and kind of giving us a differentiation between requirements versus recommendations. We often get that question when we go out and do risk control visits. Is this required for my insurance or is this just a recommendation? Do I have to do this? So we do field that question a lot. So having some clarification on the difference between the two is really great. So I thank you for hopping on today.
Absolutely. And thank you for having me.
Yes, sir. And I want to thank you for listening to the program today and for your interest in VFIS safety resources. I want to thank our guest, Justin Eberly, once again for his time and information. Please consider subscribing to our program to stay up to date on new content releases. Also, if you like what you've heard today, please consider leaving a comment or a review below. For more information about the many resources available from VFIS, please visit VFIS.com. And to submit ideas for future discussions, please reach out by emailing VFISriskcontrol@VFIS.com. Thanks, everyone, and have a great day. The views, information, or opinions expressed during this program are solely those of the individuals involved and do not necessarily represent those of Gladfelter Insurance Group, VFIS, and its employees.